Senator Rubio, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you.
Let me start with Fidel Castro's death. You know, when you and I were growing up in Miami, this was a day that many people dreamed about, many people wondered what the impact would be. This day has come, and I don't know about you, but does it feel more anticlimactic than you thought it would?
Well, imagine if Fidel had died 20 years ago, it wouldn't be about his death. This is not just about his death, it was about his removal from power. And that would have mattered 20, 25 years ago. But practically, since about 2006, Fidel Castro has not run the day-to-day affairs of Cuba. So he's kind of been around, as a figure behind the scenes, writing articles and columns and perhaps influencing and acting as the conscience of the revolution, even though he himself has no conscience. But the bottom line is that as far as the practical day-to-day affairs, that transition happened about a decade ago. And so his death is a historical milestone, and I imagine a psychological one for a lot of people.
Right.
But from a practical standpoint, Cuba today is governed exactly the same way as it was 48 hours ago.
Do you hold on any hope that it's possible Raul Castro was holding off on making some changes while Fidel was alive?
No. I mean, Raul Castro's 85. So I hear people say the younger Castro. The younger Castro's 85 years old. And he's basically been involved in the government of that country since day one. He's basically been governing it for the last 10 years. The thing people don't understand is he's not Gorbachev. He's not a reformer thinking for the best interest of Cuba long term. His number one interest is to make permanent the system of government because they have an extended family and friends who depend on the system of government for their livelihood. They want this system of government to become a permanent and accepted way to govern an island nation, and that's what their number one interest is right now.
You put out a statement a couple weeks ago after the election saying this: rolling back President Obama's one-sided concessions to the Castro regime, a key campaign promise shared with President-elect Trump, will be a top priority for me next year.
Yes, absolutely.
Are you convinced it's a top priority for President-elect Trump that he will?
I am.
Okay, so let me ask you this. So you're going to fight to lift, to put back in the travel sanctions on commercial and private travel? Are you going to put Cuba back on the state sponsor of terrorism list? Are you going to close the embassy? What are you going to do? Walk me through.
First of all, I think we want to look at all the changes that were made, because let's take a step back. Everything should be guided by our goal. Our goal is not to punish. Our goal is to figure out what can we do through U.S. policy to, number one, look out for the national interest of the United States, and number two, to help create an environment where we are creating the potential for a transition to a democratic order in Cuba at some point in the near future. So we would examine every policy to see whether or not that policy helps us down the line. And I would add to that I do think that many of these things, whether it's increased remittances, increased travel, but particularly some of the banking regulations, which I believe are illegal to begin with, that some of these banking changes that have been made, they should all be conditioned upon specific changes on the part of the Cuban government. For example, I think that as long as they are harboring fugitives of American justice like Joanne Chesmar, who killed a New Jersey state trooper and has been living in Cuba protected by the Cuban government, that should be specifically tied to something that we're doing over here. Not to mention freedom of the press, freedom of expression, freedom of organization. On the other hand, I have never said that I'm against all changes to Cuba policy. I'm just against unilateral changes from which we get nothing in return for our country or for the freedom or liberty of the Cuban people. So I would look at the model of what we've done with Myanmar or Burma as an example of how you can condition openings in exchange for democratic changes on the part of the other government. And that did not happen here. So we'll examine the entire thing. We'll make suggestions to the Trump administration.
Okay. Speaking of the Trump administration, are you concerned about Donald Trump's business ties and the fact that there really isn't a conflict of interest law that governs how he's supposed to handle his business as president?
Well, as I said, I mean, he's obviously someone who's not held public office, so he's going into the presidency. He has business ties. We knew that. Voters knew that when he got elected. And now he'll hire, imagine, a White House counsel, already has, and they're going to work through that and decide the appropriate way to separate himself from his business affairs.
What do you think is appropriate?
Well, first of all, I don't know the extent. I really don't know the entire
Isn't that part of the
nature
problem?
of his. In terms of what, I'm sorry?
That we don't know? You don't know? Shouldn't you know the nature? Shouldn't we in the public all know the nature of his business dealings around the world now?
And my sense is that he's going to declare those now as he moves forward, and that will be the job of the White House counsel to lay out exactly what his business interests are and what they are doing to separate those from the decisions he's making in the White House. I imagine they're well aware that this is something they're going to have to confront. As I said, the elections have been less than 3 weeks away, so they're working through a transition process. There's nothing wrong with expecting them to show that, and I expect that they will.
Let me ask you this. It was interesting. You issued statements praising Donald Trump's choice of Mike Pompeo for CIA. You praised him for picking Nikki Haley for ambassador to the UN. But we noticed you didn't have any statements for Mike Flynn as National Security Advisor or Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. Should we read anything into that? First, Mike Flynn.
No, Mike Flynn doesn't come before Senate confirmation. That's why we didn't comment on it. And I'm not on the Judiciary Committee, which Jeff Sessions will have to go through before he reaches anything I have to vote on. The three you mentioned, Nikki Haley will go through the Foreign Relations Committee, which I sit on. Pompeo will go through the Intelligence Committee, which I sit on. And I also happen to know both of them well and know them personally. I also know Jeff Sessions. We have a good working relationship. But I'll respect the process that we have, which means he'll have to go through the process of the Senate Judiciary Committee. And if he emerges from that, then he'll go to the full Senate. And at that point, I'll have something to say. It's the way we've handled basically every nomination, for the most part, under President Obama and now under President-elect Trump.
So you're not ready to say if you'll support the confirmation of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General?
No, I never do until that person works their way through the process. Now, in the case of Pompeo and Nikki Haley, they'll come through our committee. I think they were a good choice. They'll still have to go through the same process as anybody else. And if something emerges from that, which I don't expect, then obviously we'll comment on it.
Speaking of your committee, you had said, for instance, you would not talk about WikiLeaks at all during the campaign. You said the Russian government was involved and you thought it was inappropriate, and you knew that okay, this was hurting the Democrats today, tomorrow it could be your party. You are chair of a subcommittee on Western Hemisphere, transnational crime, civilian security, democracy, human rights, and global women's issues. You could call your own hearing investigating, because this could be a crime that was committed by the Russian government when it came to WikiLeaks. Do you plan on investigating if no other committee steps up and does it?
Well, first of all, in order for us to investigate that in my subcommittee, we need the permission of the full committee. And I imagine that Senator Corker may have an opinion on that. He may himself want to do that. You'll have to ask him. I'm open to that. Look, here's the bottom line. If a foreign government has been involved in injecting chaos into our democratic process, the American people deserve to know that. I've made my feelings known in the midst of the campaign. And I will continue to focus on that. And I will just say to you that I think it would be inappropriate, and it's something that we should not allow to stand without informing the American people of that reality. Let me just say this. I've never said it's the Russian government, although I believe it was the work of a foreign government. I will say this. If you look at what happened during our election and the sort of things that were interjected into the election process, they are very similar to the sort of active measures that you've seen the Russians use in the past in places like Eastern Europe to interfere with the elections of other countries. And what we mean by interfere is they try to undermine the credibility of the election, they try to undermine individual leaders, and they try to create chaos in the political discourse. And the fundamental argument behind it is they want people they want to delegitimize the process.
Is it worthy of congressional scrutiny?
Absolutely.
All right. And final question. Donald Trump is going to rescind a lot of executive orders that President Obama made. I may ask you one specifically. It's called DACA, essentially for dreamers, granting essentially, we can shorthand it here, amnesty for those who were brought into this country as children, and so that they're protected and not deported. What is your recommendation to Donald Trump on that specific executive order?
So my recommendation would be that there are people that have already availed themselves of that, and that there's a period of time for that. I would not retroactively remove their status. I would say that from some point forward, people will not be allowed to apply for renewal for that status. And that will give us a defined period of time to work through this, beginning with border security and modernization of the legal immigration system.
So don't rescind it immediately.
Well, people already have it. So someone has that DACA permit, but it's not indefinite. It expires. And what I would say is if you have it, you'll have it for the remainder of that period of time, but you will not be able to renew it. In the meantime, when it's not a long period of time, but it does give us the time to do border security, modernization, and then move to something very reasonable for people like those who came here as children or those who have been here for a long time who are not criminals, to allow them to attain some legal status through a legal way, not an unconstitutional way, which is what DACA is.
Senator Marco Rubio, I got to leave it there. Republican from Florida. Always good to have you on, sharing your views. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
You got it. Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and then click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.